Acts, the 4th chapter, the 32nd verse, and it says, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. And so for just a few minutes, I wanted to tie all this together under the theme of a cooperative legacy. When I think about my parents, who both have transitioned, they weren't necessarily pushing me to be part of a cooperative. They were simply trying to give us a better life than what they had. They recognized that there had been a long struggle for us to be free, and they instilled that sense of wanting to be free and wanting more for my family. And that led me, they took me to the March on Washington in '63 where Dr. King spoke, and that changed my life. Attending that meeting at Washington, D.C. in '63 where King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, changed my life and put me on this path that led me to be part of the group that formed Us, Lifting Us. So with that kind of a theme, with your permission, I want to share just briefly a slide presentation so that you'll have some sense of what is Us Lifting Us and the opportunity that it holds, I think, for all of our families. And after we're finished, if you have a few questions, I'll be happy to answer your questions. Is that okay with everybody? Write our own story and live our own story. So we entitled this presentation, Welcome to Wakanda Now. And this is an induction manual for training to understand Us Lifting Us. So the first question is, what is an economy? Most of us understand an economy as the system of production and distribution of goods and services used by a society, and it's certainly that. But it is also the mechanism that materializes the society's values, the process that concretizes their ideas and ideals. In other words, this country calls itself a great democracy. Whether or not that is true is revealed in the economic system. So if people can starve to death because they don't have money, that tells you something about the ideals. It's through the economy that the real values of the society are practiced. What is the mode of production? So in other words, to understand why we are doing this work on a cooperative and getting involved in economy, the first thing we have to do is understand some very basic things about what an economy is, what are the components of that economy, how it works. So, what is the mode of production? That's a term that I want us to hear, mode of production. Hunting and gathering was a mode of production in the early part of human civilization. In other words, people didn't have factories, they didn't have cars, they didn't have planes. The way they fed themselves and clothed themselves was they walked around, they picked the fruit off the trees and the berries off the bushes, and that's how they sustained themselves, right? Another mode of production was, as that mode of production became more systematized, they then moved into slavery, right? So by now, agriculture has been developed. And for the record, agriculture developed first in Egypt. So the key to all civilizations starts with the development of agriculture. Egypt is the breadbasket of the world at the beginning. But at any rate, slavery was a mode of production, and you have master-slave relationships. Following slavery, we see feudalism, whereas the slaves are no longer directly and capitalism. So, next slide. Who owns the means of production? This is the main difference between whether you're a capitalist or socialist. Under slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, the means of production are privately owned and controlled. Right? Next slide. During the hunting and gathering era, the means of production are individually owned. In other words, the only tools that were available during the hunting period was something to pull things down from high trees, clubs to fend off dangerous animals. So those tools are basically the property of the individuals who made them. Make sense? Means of production individually owned. Next. During the socialist era, the means of production are publicly owned and controlled through the state or the government. In other words, if you think about some of the countries in South America that had revolutions, the state took over the national industry. So in Venezuela, the state took over the oil production and used the profits from oil production to help the people live better lives. And that's why Trump and them are so angry with them, because they want that oil for their own use. So during socialism, the means of production are publicly owned. Communism, next one, go ahead. Is a society or nation where the means of production are available and accessible to everybody for the benefit of everybody. Next slide. In other words, in communist society and in African communal societies, the means of production are under the control of the total society. There is no private ownership or control over the means of production. Are we still together? All right, next slide. So the components of an economic system are, next slide, modes of production, we talked about that, next slide. Means of production, we talked about that. Production relations, in other words, the boss-worker relationship, the slave-master relationship, the serf-owner-landlord relationship, those are production relations. The mode of production plus the means of production plus the production relations equals, next slide, the level of the productive forces. Now, why is that important? Next slide. This is Amilcar Cabral. He was a revolutionary leader in Africa during the late 60s, early 70s. He headed up a group called the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands. Powerful revolutionary thinker. And here's what he said about freedom and liberation. We can therefore conclude that national liberation exists only when the national productive forces have been completely freed from every kind of foreign domination. Now this is important because the African countries all gained independence starting in Ghana in 1957, right? Ghana, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, all across the continent, they gained freedom. But their economies were still controlled by Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany. So even though they had their flags and they had independence, they were not free. Next slide, please. So, an economy expresses philosophy. This is the point that I really want us to hear. Next slide. A people's economy is their value system, their philosophy in concrete action. Next slide. Next slide. These are the African values. And I want you to hear these and see, does this make sense from the way that you grew up and what we hope to see come in the future? The acknowledgement and recognition that most fundamental aspect of existence is spirit, and that this should underpin all forms of interaction within the African. In other words, ultimate reality, when you boil it all down to, in African understanding, is God. It's a spirit. You can't touch it, you can't see it. You follow what I'm saying? You can't hold it in your hand. But for African people, that's the most important aspect of reality. In European culture, it's material. If you can't touch it, see it, feel it, taste it, it's not real. In other words, in America, everybody's from Missouri, show me. Africans take the position that the most important aspect of reality is spirit. And therefore, we have to construct an economic system that has spirit at the center of that model. Does that make sense? Okay, next slide. The view that the earth is a living, organic organism which must be treated with respect. We're in an environmental crisis right now, is that right?
Yes.
We hear people talking about global warming.
Yes.
We see the weather going crazy.
Yes.
It's because as a society, we have not respected the earth. We just willy-nilly use up the resources. We do all kinds of strange things. We dump factory runoff into the rivers and the streams. We pollute the fish, the air, all that stuff. The African view was that the earth is a living organism which must be treated with respect. All indigenous people, Native Americans, had that understanding. That's why after 5,000 years of being on earth, the earth was still pristine and clean. 500 years of European control, and the planet is about to choke to death. The understanding that individuality is good and to be celebrated, and that individualism is bad and destructive of social relationships. In other words, we all have grown up in villages and communities where the community was important, right?
Right.
And people in the community found ways to help the community be stronger. The idea that one individual could use the community for their own personal benefit and not give anything back, that's a very strange idea. That's not the way African people think about community. The way we say it is, because we are, therefore I am. And because I am, therefore we are. So we understand the relationship of the individual to the community. You can't have one without the other. The understanding, the next slide. The understanding that human beings are custodians, trustees, guardians of the land, and therefore the land cannot be owned, but only utilized for the benefit of society. Now that's a radical idea. In early African civilizations, on up until the 17th century, Africans had access to the land. Everybody had enough land to farm and raise their animals on, but the idea of private ownership of the land was a very foreign notion. That the land could be sold to somebody else was even more foreign. God had given the land to the people for the people to use. So you didn't sell it, you just used it, and when you didn't need it any longer, it went back to the village council, and they gave it to whoever else might need it. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? You follow what I'm saying? In this country, we own the land. All right, next slide. And the recognition of the vital role played by women in the economy, whether in paid or unpaid capacities, and the determination to attribute appropriate value and support. In other words, our value is that women are important. We think that women are the basis of community and therefore have to be respected and treated with respect. This idea that women are some kind of just something to be used and thrown away or turned into objects for sexual pleasure and gratification, those are not ideas that are part of the African understanding. All right. And finally, the determination to institute small-scale, low-consumption things. The recognition of the family as the foundation of society, and hence the need to build an economics that recognizes that. Next slide. Now, you may recognize these: truth, justice, righteousness, order, balance, harmony, reciprocity. That's an old Egyptian concept called ma'at. And it's just, everybody followed that, and when you died, you wanted the end of your life to be able to say, I was truthful, I was righteous, I was in order, I was balanced, I gave back, I lived in harmony. That was the goal of life. You're familiar with Kwanzaa. These are the 7 principles of Kwanzaa: Umoja, Kuja, Chagalia, Ujima, Ujamaa, Nia, Kuumba, Imani. Basically, unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. So these are the values that Lifitng Us wanted to incorporate in the way we do business. Because we think these values not only protect African Americans and Africans, they protect all life on the planet. All the values we have listed comprise a value matrix. I take it no matter what it does to the community. What does that say? Get all you can all you get, then sit on the can. Competition, survival of the fittest. That individualism we know from the Lone Ranger kind of movies, the John Wayne character, the rugged individual, all of that hyper-individualism that we see today. Greed, maximum profit at all costs. So how much is enough? It's never enough. You always have to do more tomorrow than you did yesterday. If you sold 100 widgets yesterday, you got to sell 150 widgets today. And what happens is that's not sustainable. You wind up using all the resources up, and then what do? Well, you go to somebody else's country and start the cycle all over again. But that means you're always in a state of being at war, because you're always trying to take somebody's stuff from them. So you wind up with violence, war, and without war making, this particular economy, that is capitalism, collapses. The idea that life is random without purpose. Stuff happens, and he who dies with the most toys wins. That's kind of the mindset. So number 45 becomes the symbol of how bizarre that kind of thinking is. But because he's a billionaire, right, he does whatever he wants to do, and no one challenges that. Okay, next slide. In order to achieve your American values, require a specific economic system. In order to achieve a society that practices Euro-American philosophy and values, capitalism was introduced, which allows white European males primarily to dominate and control the entire world. Free enterprise, is it really? Democracy, where? Market economy, you follow what I'm saying? They got these terms out there, but the way it actually plays out is extremely exploitative. Next slide. So Dr. King said this, an economic political solution for African descended people. Now this, by the way, is a quote taken from the speech that he gave at Riverside Church in New York in 1997, April the 4th. It was a speech entitled A Time to Break Silence, where he came out against the Vietnam War. And in that speech he said, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. In other words, Dr. King was calling for a shift from those European Western values to African values. He was really talking about a shift from capitalism to some kind of communal system that allowed the people to control the wealth. Everybody with me? So back up just 1 minute. So a cooperative legacy then is the gift from our ancestors. This is what all this is leading to. We have to make our own system, our own economic system, if we're going to be free. Next slide. So, and this is the last slide, I think. Lifitng Us, Economic Development Cooperative LLC, is a family-centered, community-owned and controlled cooperative designed to regain economic control of the black community, to create jobs, to operate small, medium, and large-scale cooperative businesses in the U.S., on the continent of Africa, and throughout the Caribbean and the diaspora, everywhere African people live. We voluntarily pool our money through the issuing of co-op units. In other words, we invite all who participate in ULU. You don't have to do this as soon as you get in, but at some point, the goal is each of us will purchase a co-op unit of $1,000. Every 1,000 people who buy a co-op unit, that equals $1 million. We use those dollars to operate other cooperative businesses that in turn create more jobs, etc., etc., etc. In other words, this is the engine that runs the economy that serves our people. Next slide. That's the last one. We then use that pool money to operate cooperative businesses. And the main point that I want us to understand about the cooperative is that everybody who becomes a member of the cooperative is an equal owner in the wealth of the profit that that business generates, right? So you and I, we live in this country, we patronize various businesses, whether we are buying gas or groceries, but at the end of the quarter, we don't get a dividend from those businesses, do we? When you are part of a co-op, at the end of the quarter, whatever profits were generated, they cut you a check to say thank you for being part of the cooperative. All right? So that's the main difference why we are arguing that part of the solution for our freedom as a people must come through the development of cooperatives. And the good news is we own and control these institutions ourselves. That's the last slide. Any comments, any questions, any thoughts? Okay, we're good. Big enough to where we had the resources, and 2 years ago we voted to use some of that resource to launch our first business. And the first business that we started was called Cafe ULU. It's a coffee shop and internet lounge cafe in Atlanta, Georgia. We launched a coffee lounge for a couple of reasons. One, next to gasoline and oil, coffee is the most highest traded commodity in the world. Also, that Africans were the ones that originated coffee as a beverage. So Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Cameroon, Kenya, these are coffee producing countries, and it's African farmers that are harvesting the beans, so that when we buy these African coffees, we are supporting African farmers. Make sense? And so a lot of us drink coffee, and all we're saying to ourselves is, let's purchase the coffee in a mechanism that allows us to control the wealth of this commodity. So we are in conversation with Africans on the continent who are producing the coffee. We're in the process of acquiring a roaster so we can roast our own beans. Just one startup business. This is not the end of the journey. This is just the first start. And in other words, to help people understand, how do we go into business? What kind of businesses do we operate? And once Cafe ULU becomes profitable, then we will use a portion of that profits. One, we'll reinvest it in the business. Two, we will use it to undergird educational institutions in our community. And thirdly, we will give a dividend back to the owner members. So everyone who is a member of ULU is also an owner. So that's when someone asks you, had you heard about ULU? What do you think about becoming a member of ULU? I want you to understand that not only are you a member, you are also an owner. And that's the difference that begins to put us on a path to, once again, writing our own history, controlling our own destiny. You have to control the means of production if you're going to be free. As long as we're looking for a good job from General Motors or Amazon or whoever, they will be the ones writing history. We will just be the subject matter that they wrote about. You follow what I'm saying? And whatever they do, we can do also. We've already done at one point or another. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I love the name of this group, Us Lifting Us. We do it ourselves.
Right.
It's not waiting for somebody else to do it for us. We got to do it ourselves.
And this is in addition to the people that are already in our community doing business. We're not saying that's not important. We're just saying this is an additional component that will allow us to take it to an even higher level. Because I think we've all experienced as individual entrepreneurs, we can grow so big, and then we need additional resources to take it further. When we have a strong cooperative mechanism like an ULU in our community, that becomes a resource that has funds to make available to help other businesses expand and grow. I'll just close with this. There's a region in northern Spain called the Basque region. And the people who live there are called Basque. They have their own language. They are not Europeans. Europeans don't like them. They came out of a horrible civil war at the end of 1939. They were destitute, they were broke, and they had to take care of themselves. So they started a co-op making kerosene heaters. 6 people went to work making kerosene heaters. They had been in training for 10 years studying cooperative principles. In 1956, they opened the business. In 20 years, that one business had gone from one business to 200 businesses, from 6 employees to 80,000 employees, to the point that they were making $20 billion of revenue on an annual basis. So what we're talking about is not pie in the sky. It's actually being done by other groups on the ground. All they did was harness their own economic reach. In other words, they did business with themselves. And because they were not liked by the other Europeans, they were able to stay inside of their own space, develop themselves, and now they're this global force that the rest of the world has to reckon with. The reason that they're not liked is because the Europeans think they got black blood in them, so they keep them like the N-word of Europe. We're familiar with that narrative. But long story short, the cooperative model allows us to go from very few resources, harness our own wealth, and operate billion-dollar industries. That sounds something that would be interesting to us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions or thoughts before we wrap up? Well, we thank you all for staying because I know you all had eaten and we got here early and we had to wait to get seated, but thank you all for staying. And let's give our brother Kimbisi an applause. Thank you so much.